We have a great Founders Memorial lecture tonight. The award winner this year, well, the award was established in 1958, so it's been going on for a long time. And the point of this award is to honor the memory of those scientists that have made outstanding contributions to entomology. And this year, the winner is Dr. Gene Kritsky. Gene is a professor of biology at Mount St. Joseph College in Cincinnati. He's an adjunct curator of entomology at the Cincinnati Museum Center, editor-in-chief of the American Entomologist, longtime editor of that important publication, and he'll be delivering the lecture honoring Charles Darwin. Gene is uniquely qualified to honor Darwin because Gene is a lifelong student of Charles Darwin. Gene has just about every photograph that has been produced of Darwin. Gene has memorabilia of Darwin. He's gone to England to visit with Darwin's descendants. Gene's email address is cdarwin@aol.com. So Gene is, he lives, eats, and breathes Charles Darwin. It's his life. So Gene, if you will, please honor the memory of Charles Darwin.
Thank you, President Brown, for that invitation. And I'd like to thank the Awards Committee and ESA for this honor. Today, we honor Charles Darwin for his contributions to our science. Charles Robert Darwin was born on February 12, 1809 in Shrewsbury, England, the same day and the same year that Abraham Lincoln was born in Kentucky. Unlike Lincoln, unlike Lincoln, who was born in a log cabin, Darwin was born in a more grand home. He was the youngest son of Robert Darwin, a wealthy and respected physician, and the grandson of Erasmus Darwin. As a boy, Darwin liked to collect stamps, rocks, and like a lot of us, beetles. Darwin documented his early interest in insects in an early, just recently discovered autobiographical writing. He wrote, "I must have observed insects with some little care, for when 10 years old, I went for 3 weeks to the seacoast in Wales. I was very much interested and surprised at seeing a large black and scarlet hemipterous insects, many moths, and a cicindela, which are not found in Shropshire." His entomological interest continued into his teen years, as documented by a letter from his sister, Emily Catherine, when she wrote to Darwin, at the time age 14, "How does your entomology go on?" Darwin's entomological pursuits became serious when he started his studies at Christ College at Cambridge with the long-range goal of becoming a clergyman. The vocational change came after he left Edinburgh, where he was studying medicine. Darwin was introduced to the serious nature of insect collecting by his cousin, William Darwin Fox. Fox, who was 4 years older than Darwin, accompanied him on beetle collecting forays in and around Cambridge. Soon, Darwin became obsessed with collecting. He wrote, "It is quite absurd how interested I'm getting in the science." Darwin and Fox hired local Cambridge boys to help them collect and also paid them to collect on their own. Like many entomologists today, Darwin tried equipment that was not part of the typical entomological arsenal. Leonard Jennings wrote of Darwin's methods, "He occasionally came over to me at my vicarage, and we entomologized together in the woods of Bottisham Hall. He sweeping the long grass and weeds with a great canvas bag net in a most vigorous way, an implement I had not been in the habit of using myself." His beetle collecting was so intense that one of his college colleagues drew a cartoon of Darwin riding the back of a beetle with his unusual insect net. Darwin described the intensity of his beetle collecting in his autobiography written for his family. "But no pursuit at Cambridge was followed with nearly so much eagerness or gave me so much pleasure as collecting beetles. It was the mere passion for collecting, for I did not dissect them and rarely compared their external characters with published descriptions, but got them named anyhow. I'll give you proof of my zeal. One day, on tearing off some old bark, I saw 2 rare beetles and seized one in each hand. Then I saw a third, and a new kind, which I could not bear to lose. So I popped the one which I held in my right hand into my mouth. Alas, it ejected some intensely acrid fluid which burnt my tongue, so I was forced to spit the beetle out, which was lost, as well as the third one. But Darwin was simply not content just to collect. He and Fox corresponded about the names of the various insects they had collected. At this time, when field guides were non-existent and Latin descriptions imprecise, such identifications became difficult. Thus, Darwin sought the aid of more experienced entomologists to help. He visited the entomologist Frederick Hope in London, where he spent 2 days going over Hope's collection. When he left, he took well over 100 identified specimens and gained an extremely favorable impression of entomologists. He wrote to his cousin on the 29th of October, 1828 about Hope, "He is a perfect specimen of an entomologist, so generous, straightforward. My head is quite full of entomology." Darwin's collecting around Cambridge also resulted in the first time his name appeared in print, and Darwin was suitably proud of this contribution, for he crowed to his cousin, "You will see my name in Stephen's last number." Indeed, his pride in this event was long-lived, for 37 years later he wrote, "No poet ever felt more delight at seeing his first poem published than I did in seeing in Stephen's Illustrations of British Insects the magic words, captured by C. Darwin, Esquire." After his graduation from Cambridge and some convincing of his father, Darwin started on what he called the most important event of his career, the voyage of the Beagle. The Beagle voyage required Darwin to divide his scientific interest. He still collected insects, but his fascination for geology blossomed as he rode across the Pampas and over the Andes. Darwin matured into a scientist during the voyage. The obsession with collecting beetles for the sake of collecting evolved into a more systematic approach of surveying the fauna of the regions he visited. Darwin, and sometimes his assistant, Sims Covington, used both aquatic and aerial nets and natural baits such as dung, flowers, carrion, and even spider webs to catch insects. The specimens were preserved in alcohol and pill boxes, with the more fragile specimens being pinned. These were boxed up and sent from Rio de Janeiro, Montevideo, East Falkland Island, Valparaiso to John Henslow, Darwin's college mentor at Cambridge. The voyage left England on December 27, 1831. The first leg was the east coast of South America. Darwin suffered greatly from seasickness on the voyage, and to lessen his suffering, he availed himself to every opportunity to spend time ashore. In fact, of the nearly 5-year-long voyage, he was actually on board only about a year. While along the east coast of South America, he received a letter from Frederick Hope telling him of the formation of an entomological society. Hope writes, "You will be glad to hear that we have established an entomological society. After consulting Eaton, I took the liberty of putting your name down as a member of the Entomological Society." Darwin was pleased to be named a member. He wrote to his cousin Fox about his membership shortly before his return to England. "I look at the orange cross, the emblem of the society, as the emblem of entomological knighthood." Might be a new honor for the society. Darwin's scientific experience continued as the Beagle sailed into the Pacific. It was Darwin's visit to the Galapagos in 1835 that was to inspire his thinking about species. Here, Darwin visited geologically young volcanic islands and collected endemic species of lizards, birds, and insects. It was the Galapagos that challenged Darwin's thinking about species and led him to ponder the mystery of mysteries. You see, in Darwin's day, it was widely believed that all species were created at one time. Centuries later, life was destroyed by a global flood, and the animals that did survive repopulated the world, dispersing from what is modern-day Turkey. What Darwin found at the Galapagos challenged that view. These Galapagos islands were young islands, and they possessed animals and plants that occurred nowhere else in the world. Moreover, many of these animals are incapable of such global dispersals. So how did they get there? To Darwin, these animals had to have been created on the Galapagos after the island's recent formation. Thus, the fundamental assumption of a single creation event did not fit this biogeography. Darwin later wrote that this mystery haunted him. The voyage continued across the Pacific to Australia, across the Indian and Atlantic Oceans back to South America. before the Beagle turned northward to arrive in England in 1836. Darwin returned to England with the reputation of an established naturalist. The specimens he had sent to John Henslow had captured the attention of England's scientific community to the point that Henslow felt compelled to publish his letters from Darwin, which further increased interest. Now back home, he started to analyze the material he had collected. He received a large grant to supervise the publication of the zoology of the Voyage, and he edited his diary of the Voyage into what eventually became the best-selling book, which we now call The Voyage of the Beagle. Fortunately, Darwin's father was in a position to financially support his son with an annual stipend that was the equivalent to a typical college professor's salary today. In fact, Darwin never held a paying job his entire life. His wealth came from an endowment from his father and royalties from his best-selling books. In 1838, the bachelor Darwin started to think about getting married. In fact, he analyzed this question twice that year. But in July, the second time, he carefully weighed out the situation by comparing the pros and cons, and we still have this document. At the top of a page, he wrote, "This is the question," followed by two headings: marry or not marry. Unmarried grad students, I want you to pay attention. Under marry, he wrote, "Children, if it please God, constant companion and friend in old age, who will feel interested in one, object to be beloved and played with, better than a dog anyhow. Home and someone to take care of house, charms of music and female chit-chat, these things good for one's health, capital letters, but a terrible loss of time." Under not marry, freedom to go where one liked, choice of society and little of it, conversation of clever men at clubs, not forced to visit relatives, to bend in every trifle, to have the expense and anxiety of children, perhaps quarreling, capital letters, double underline, loss of time, cannot read in the evenings, fatness and idleness, anxiety, responsibility, less money for books. If many children, forced to gain one's bread, but in parentheses, but then it's very bad for one's health to work too much. Second paragraph under marry, my God, it's intolerable to think of spending one's whole life like a neuter bee, working, and nothing after all. No, won't do. Imagine living all one's day solitary in dirty, smoky London house. Only picture to yourself a nice, soft wife on a sofa with a good fire and books and music, perhaps. Compare this vision with the dingy reality of my apartments in Marlborough Street. Marry, QED. Now that he had decided to marry, the next question was to whom? He immediately thought of his cousin Emma and wasted no time to go to see her. But when he arrived, he couldn't muster the courage to propose. 4 months later, he finally did. And after their marriage, they lived in London for 2 years before moving to a little village of Down, about 7 miles southeast. This is where Darwin, Emma, and their eventual 10 children, 7 survived him, lived for the next 40 years. Now, Darwin's entomological interests changed during this period. Although he did collect a few beetles with his sons from around Down, he was no longer possessed with collecting specimens. Rather, he collected observations. His letters from 1837 to 1858, sent to entomologists and naturalists all over the world, requested information on insect distributions, variation, sexual dimorphism, and pollinators. He didn't consider himself a beekeeper, yet he did borrow an observation hive to observe the construction of honeycomb. He wrote to his cousin Fox during this time, while he was focusing on the concept of natural selection, "I now find my little entomology, which I wholly owe to you, comes in very useful." After laboring over articles for 6 years, Darwin turned his attention to his big book. The project was to be a multi-volume series titled Natural Selection. He had by this time solved the mystery of mysteries, but was not anxious to go to print without considerable more evidence to back up his ideas. But to test his ideas, in 1856, he hosted a gathering of 3 scientists to serve as his sounding board. His guests included Joseph Hooker, a botanist, Thomas Huxley, a zoologist and paleontologist, and Thomas Wollaston, an entomologist. During the meeting, Darwin asked his colleagues to find fault with his thinking, although he didn't give up all the details. It was a lively session that focused on the question of the fixity of species. Darwin's close friend, the geologist Charles Lyell, who already knew about Darwin's ideas, described the gathering in a letter to his brother. When Huxley, Hooker, and Wallace were at Darwin's last week, they, all four of them, ran a tilt against immutable species. Farther, I believe, than they were deliberately prepared to go. Wollaston least unorthodox. I cannot easily see how they could go so far and not embrace the whole Lamarckian doctrine. Darwin thought the meeting went pretty well, although the entomologist Wollaston was generally not supportive. Darwin continued writing his big book when in June of 1858 he received a letter from another entomologist, Alfred Russel Wallace. Along with the letter, Wallace included a short paper that described the exact process Darwin had been working on for the past 20 years. Wallace wanted Darwin's thought on the paper and advice on publishing. Darwin was stunned. So on the advice of Charles Lyell and Joseph Hooker, Wallace's paper and excerpts from an essay Darwin wrote in 1844, but never published, were read at a special meeting of the Linnaean Society. The papers did not create the stir that Darwin had feared. As a result of these events, Darwin decided to scrap the multi-volume project and instead focused on writing a shorter book, a mere abstract of his views. The book was titled On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection and was published in November of 1859. On the Origin of Species, while not a book solely on insects, was infested with insect references. But it was the theory described in the book, which we now call the theory of evolution through natural selection, that was Darwin's greatest entomological contribution. Initial reviews of Darwin's book were mixed. While Darwin appreciated the positive reviews, he was stung by the negative ones. One of the first was published in the Athenaeum and was anonymous, which was a common practice. Darwin had to think about this, and he was convinced that it was by the entomologist John Westwood from Oxford. A few months later, another review by the entomologist Andrew Murray was published in the Proceedings of the Royal Society of Edinburgh. Although the review was negative, Murray sent Darwin proof sheets, and their correspondence was quite cordial. Darwin wrote to Murray, thanking him for his kindness, and added, quote, I never knew or heard of a hostile reviewer doing so kind and generous an action. But the review that really hurt was by Wollaston, the entomologist who was part of Darwin's 1856 meeting at Down. These three negative reviews led Darwin to write, the entomologists alone are enough to keep the subject, natural selection, back for half a century. But entomological support was coming. Henry Bates returned from South America in 1859 before The Origin was published, and he wrote to Darwin in 1860, detailing his views on species, variation, and support of Darwin's theory. The letter, unfortunately now lost, marked a turning point for Darwin in the entomological reaction, because Bates provided Darwin with important entomological evidence for his thesis. The correspondence between the established Darwin and the young Bates eventually grew into a mentor relationship, with Darwin offering advice, helping with reviews of Bates' work, and playing a role in Bates obtaining a salaried position. In their correspondence, Bates shared with Darwin his discovery of insect mimicry, and in his paper on the subject, Bates wrote that mimicry in insects is best explained by the, quote, theory of natural selection, as recently expounded by Mr. Darwin in The Origin of Species. Later, Fritz Müller, with his mimicry example, wrote Darwin with his mimicry example, even including glued butterfly wings on a piece of paper to send him. In 1862, Alfred Wallace returned to England from Southeast Asia and quickly joined Bates as a defender of Darwin. By 1866, Darwin's entomological supporters had moved into influential positions, and they were ready to counter any entomological attack on Darwin. A prime example occurred in 1867 with the publication of the Duke of Argyll's book, The Reign of Law. The Duke had reviewed Darwin's book, titled On the Various Contrivances by which British and Foreign Orchids are Fertilized by Insects, and he disagreed with Darwin's view that natural selection could explain the existence of a moth on Madagascar with an extremely long proboscis. The Duke argued that the moth-orchid relationship demonstrated, quote, light and reason of mind, unquote. And to the Duke, that mind was divine. Wallace counterattacked with a paper titled Creation by Law, in which he argued that the moth could have evolved the long proboscis with only natural selection acting on favorable variations. Darwin recognized his growing acceptance within the entomological community. In 1867, he wrote Ernst Haeckel, his major German supporter, quote, no body of men were first so much opposed to my views as the members of the London Entomological Society. But now I'm assured that with the exception of 2 or 3 old men, all the members concur with me to a certain extent. During the same period, American entomologists rose to support Darwin. In 1864, Darwin received a letter from Benjamin Walsh, a former classmate of his from Cambridge. Walsh wrote, quote, allow me to take this opportunity of thanking you for your publication of Your Origin of Species, which I read 3 years ago by the advice of a botanical friend. Though I had strong prejudice against what I supposed your views were to be, the first perusal staggered me. The second convinced me. And the oftener I read it, the more convinced I am of the general soundness of your theory. As you've called upon naturalists that believe in your view to give public testimony of their convictions, I have directed your attention on the outside of 1 or 2 of my pamphlets to the particular pages in which I have done so. You will please accept these papers from me in token of my respect and admiration. Walsh's next letter to Darwin included his paper on certain entomological speculations of the New England School of Naturalist. This paper was a severe attack on Louis Agassiz, Darwin's harshest American critic. And in his paper, Walsh challenged Agassiz where Agassiz's natural history was the weakest, his entomology. And Walsh was effective and wrote to Darwin later in that year, quote, Darwinism is now becoming quite a common creed in the United States, especially among the entomologists. Charles Valentine Riley assumed the mantle as Darwin's major entomological advocate after Walsh's death. Riley's reports as the state entomologist of Missouri were peppered with many insect examples supporting Darwin's theory. He even visited Darwin at Down on 2 occasions. Of these visits, Riley wrote, going to him as a young entomologist with no claim on his favor, he seemed to take delight in manifesting appreciation. I had occasion in my 3rd report on the insects of Missouri, published in the spring of that year, to discuss the question of natural selection and its bearing on mimicry. This report I found in his study with many leaves turned down, and he appeared to take special pleasure in conveying a sense of his appreciation of particular parts. Darwin influenced entomologists with his 16 books, 162 papers, and his global correspondence, which by the time of his death numbered over 15,000 letters. Some of these correspondents were from other Americans who greatly influenced American entomology. Packard authored an entomology textbook which was used in many late 19th century college entomology courses. John Henry Comstock wrote Darwin in 1880, sending Darwin his report on cotton insects. Comstock considered evolution to be his own, quote, theory to work by, unquote. And he founded research groups in evolutionary entomology at Cornell and Stanford universities that produced entomologists who would carry Darwin's evolutionary philosophy into the 20th century. Darwin's contributions to entomology are descended from his theory of evolution by natural selection. This theory has helped us understand the basis of mimicry and in the 20th century, the evolution of insecticide resistance. Darwin's views on sexual selection have brought us insight into the evolution of sexual dimorphism of insects. And the coevolutionary relationships of insects and plants is fundamental to economic entomology. Darwin died on April 19, 1882. And although he has been dead for 130 years, his ideas can be found in our publications and classrooms. The influence of his work can be heard in the conference rooms at this very meeting. Every cladogram you will see this week ultimately came from Darwin. So today we name Charles Darwin as a Memorial Founder honoree. And in doing so, he joins the other Memorial Founder honorees, Walsh, Riley, Comstock, Vernon Kellogg, Herman H. Ross, Robert Snodgrass, and T.D. Cockrell, who all used Darwin's work as the foundation of their research. Thank you.